Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Welcome, people. I'm Alexandria, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. Over the last 2 years, we've had so many conversations about the things that make us inherently Caribbean, from, our inherent and creative factors like our culture and our music, to external factors like the consistent role of migration and how it plays in who we are. There are many attributes that contribute to who we are, what we do, and how we impact the world. One, which may not always readily come up in our frames of mind, which of course is the topic of today's conversation, is the influence of trade and development in the Caribbean. Joining the show today is legally trained international trade specialist and the founder of the Caribbean Trade and Development blog, Alicia Nicholls. Thank you so much for being a guest, and please tell us a bit about yourself, where in the Caribbean is near and dear to you, and what inspired your work in Caribbean trade and development.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. I am delighted to be here. Thank you for the very kind invitation to discuss this topic on Strictly Facts podcast. I have a confession to you. I actually, in preparation for this, listened to a lot of the previous episodes, and I was like, whoa, this is really informative stuff. You're doing excellent work. So I just wanted to give you kudos on that. As you said, I'm Alicia Nicholls. I'm an international trade consultant, founder of the Caribbean Trade Law blog. Since 2011, I've been writing on these issues from the beautiful island of Barbados, as I like to say, also the world's newest republic as well. We became independent in 1966, but we became a republic not too long ago. So I've been working in the area of trade for the past 14 years now. And when I tell the story about what drew me to trade, is always interesting. When I was an undergraduate student doing my bachelor's of science in political science, I did this elective in my third year called Trade and the Environment. And because I knew I wanted to go and do law at the time, and these rules and regulations about trade, etc., I fell in love with it. And when I heard that there was actually a master's dedicated to international trade policy here on campus, I decided I would do that, and the rest is history. So I'm also a researcher. I lecture in international trade. My work focuses more so on issues of foreign direct investment, international business, global financial and regulatory issues. Trade is not always a sexy topic for most people, but is one that is very important to our economies, as we will get into shortly. From what we eat, what we wear, some component comes from trade. So I am really delighted to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. I'm again so happy to have you. I think just jumping in, we are literally a region established by trade vis-a-vis colonialism, of course, right? And so thinking of our long history stemming back to, the 14 whatevers and the Columbus story, etc. I just think there's so many foundational principles of who we are that are established in trade. Could you talk a little bit about how, this historical framing of trade beyond just, what we might think in terms of like exports and imports affects who we are and what we've become over the last 400 plus years?
Certainly. And, you've hit the nail on the head so well, in that we are often seen as a region that was forged through trade. And in many cases that is so true. But I want to take you back, Alexandria, even further, right? To before the Europeans came here. So the indigenous people who actually discovered the Caribbean, as not Columbus, despite what some of the history books erroneously say. The indigenous people who came here and occupied many of these 7,000 islands, which form what is now known as the Caribbean, actually had their own networks, their own trading networks. This is stuff that I know, but your audience might not necessarily know. So, if you will permit me to just speak a little bit about this before, we speak about the colonial period. So we know that there was trade which was going on before Columbus accidentally sailed into the region in 1492. We know this because, despite the brutality of the Spanish expedition here in occupation, which enslaved a lot of the indigenous people, killed them off through brutality, but also diseases, and erased many aspects of their very rich pre colonial culture. Historians have been able to find, and learn about some of these trade links that have existed. So they, got into dugout canoes and visited other islands. They went to the South American mainland, they went to the Central American mainland, and there was a rich trade going on. And that story is often lost because we tend to focus a lot on the colonial era trade. So I just wanted to establish that there. But also, as you rightly said, the colonial era was where the Caribbean was a focal point of the slave trade and the colonial trading system. So you have ships sailing from Europe to Africa to take enslaved Africans, forcibly taken from their homeland, brought here to the Caribbean, to work on plantations, tobacco, sugar plantations. And then those ships would carry back the produce from those plantations, the bulk sugar, gold, other commodities, etc., extracted from the economies. Historians will tell you that we were established as extractive economies, and in many ways, that is perpetuating to this day. And these ships would take back these raw materials, refine them, and then sell them back to the colonies as refined products, right? So you also, talked about the fact that, the Caribbean is also a melting pot, and that it is. You have the indigenous peoples, some of whose descendants are still here, thank goodness. You have the Europeans, you have the Africans, you have Indians, you have Chinese, you have people of mixed race who came in other waves of migration afterwards to help form what is this Caribbean civilization. And of course, the Caribbean has not only been a place of immigration, but also emigration. So, the Panama Canal, many of our citizens worked on the Panama Canal. And just because of the theme of your podcast, it would be remiss of me not to mention David Ruther's song Panama. In the discussion that you had with my colleague, Dr. Megan Sylvester, a lot of our history is captured very nicely and creatively in calypsos.
Thank you so much for that. I think even, adding to your point, these waves of, who has come and gone from the Caribbean are so integral to thinking of trade, right? Even the influence of indentured servitude coming and, people from Asia coming to the Caribbean has continued to spurn what in many ways is a continuation of slavery in some senses, right? There are so many ways that I think we sometimes negate that history, right? And the impact, especially in making the connection towards trade and development, as we're talking about today. I think shifting a lot, several decades or centuries further to today, what are some of the major sources of Caribbean trade today, and how do they affect our economies?
Sure, good question. So I will first start by talking about, because we spoke about previously the patterns of trade. And I want to say that yes, there have been changes, but in many ways we could still see some of those lingering patterns today. And you'll see why when I talk, when I ask your question more directly. So as we said, a lot of the patterns we see have their genesis in colonialism, where the Caribbean colonies were developed for these extractive purposes, where the networks of trade emphasized trade between the colonies and the motherland and discouraged trade between the colonies themselves, or the colonies and other colonial powers. And what this means is that coming out of independence, our economies still mirror these patterns. So you have commodities based economies, sugar, for example, in the case of Barbados and St. Kitts and Nevis, bananas in the case of St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and our trade being mostly north south. So to the UK, to the US, etc., not that much trade, not only between us, but with our other surrounding countries, not as much south-south trade. But what you're seeing is this is starting to change. So many of our countries have been trying to diversify as far back as the 1960s, the 1970s, through promoting manufacturing, following Lewis's industrialization by invitation, for example, and of course, the development of the tourism industries and financial services. So what you see now, Alexandria, as you know, is that most of our economies now are services-based economies. And that's more so for the smaller islands. If you look at the breakdown, services, and by services, for those of you who are following and not be familiar with trade, that is invisible trade, right? So things like tourism, etc. So Barbados, for example, diversified from being an economy primarily dependent on sugar to now mainly being a tourism economy, although rum is still a major export for us. But then you still have larger economies like Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Belize, and Guyana, which are more commodities based. And Guyana, as you know, is now really the oil hub of the Western Hemisphere because of the large, oil reserves that have been found. And Jamaica is more half and half. They have tourism as a major source of exports as well as other commodities, bauxite, etc. So if you look at the data, Alexandra, you will see that in terms of services trade is very concentrated, and that's one of the things that remains a legacy of colonialism. Our trade still remains very concentrated. So in the case of services, tourism and financial services, in the case of commodities, gold, natural gas, of course, this will vary by country: petroleum, sugar, rum, bananas, fertilizers, etc. And also, it's not only just concentrated in terms of the products, but also where we export to. So, our main trading partner is still the US, both for imports and exports. Talking more macro, more regional, as opposed to specific countries. But China, interestingly, is becoming a large source of imports for the region. And, you have this push now to go into other non-traditional markets, like in Latin America, like in Africa. There's been a big push for that, and to a lesser extent the Middle East and Asia. So to go back to the theme of your podcast, and you're probably realizing what I'm doing here, Calypso has, talked about these areas of trade, and I'm thinking about that song Deo, written by Irving Berge and sung very well by Harry Belafonte, and talks about life on the banana plantation, and that just goes to show you how important the banana plantation was to certain countries back then.
I have so many follow-up thoughts based off that very, I think, just extraordinary answer. For one, you mentioned the invisible trade, right? And I think when we think of trade, oftentimes, as you mentioned, right, we think of products, but also people. And, this is clearly a historical realm, as we touched on in the previous question, talking about slavery, talking about indentured servitude, et cetera. There are several ways that people are inherent to trade as well when we think of migration. Things that come to mind based off previous episodes include, like the West Indian domestic workers scheme, and women migrating to Canada to work as domestic workers. This is also a global phenomenon, and it's not just Caribbean people, of course, but there are several ways that people, for one, become very inherent to, shaping especially the Western Hemisphere in particular. Another thing that I really want us to also just hone in on is, as you rightly focused on, the influence of China. I think we'd be remiss in this discussion not to think of the ways that China is heavily investing in our region, occupying and influencing and shaping a lot of our policies. There's even a highway near my hometown that I think they are largely responsible for refining, right? Which on one hand, I was like, oh my gosh, it's this easier way to get to Montego Bay now. But also, right, what are the ramifications of that? And so in a lot of ways, we do need to take account for how China is also influencing, I think oftentimes China conversation is usually like a, US and China and like a export, maybe electronics, whatever thing, right? But also in very much, to an extent our own detriment, it's also the ways that they're going to shape our policies moving forward.
And those are all great points, Alexandra, because the fact of the matter is that well, it is beneficial in that in many cases it's providing an alternative source of financing for our very cash-strapped governments. You have to think of, okay, so what are the ramifications of this? Especially what you see going on in other parts of the world where there've been, investments in things like ports and that sort of thing. Um, what does this mean? And what you don't want is that you shift a dependence from the global north to one country in the global south, right? And of course, it's debatable, even at the WTO, this is a big issue is could China really still be considered a developing country, given, their prowess, etc. So I completely agree with you that like with everything else, you don't want to be swapping one dependence for another dependence, but you have to leverage your relationship to the best extent possible that it allows your people to benefit from it. And if it is, as you rightly said, you're getting better roads at significantly less rates than you would if you had to go through other traditional forms of financing. Um, if it is that you might be able to get cheaper goods, cheaper does not necessarily always mean better. So that's something that we have to bear in mind. Um, if it is also that you are getting other sort of support, technical assistance and whatnot. I mean, the Chinese, as you know, provided a lot of assistance to the Caribbean in terms of vaccines, in terms of PPE. They sent as well. So like with every relationship, there's a lot of nuance. And what our governments have to do is to ensure that the relationship is leveraged for the benefit of our people.
Definitely. You touched on dependency, which I think is a very critical point, especially as small islands, right? We don't obviously have the capacity of the world powers, quote unquote, so to speak, right? Our development, particularly today, rests a lot on the ramifications of the latter 20th century. And so some of these things you mentioned, right? The economic restructuring from going from colonies to independent countries, that transition from being, sugar-based economies to ones grounded in tourism, mining, even financial flows. I'm thinking here of, remittances and offshore banking, et cetera. But also, we can't discount things like the influence of the Cold War during this time as well, the after effects of foreign powers fearing communism, right? And, through military invasions and harassment, they stationed and occupied places like Cuba, Haiti, Grenada, and really shifted what, could have been very, and still rightly are, critical moments of national development based on these supposed fears, right? But then also, lastly, I think one of the things that sometimes maybe those of my generation and younger don't always or aren't always aware of because we weren't necessarily alive or we were, very young at the time is the cost of structural adjustments, loans, the high interest rates that came off the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, really stemming back to this 80s, 90s period and, really continue to plague us today. So could you share with us a bit about, how this time period, still continues to affect us and how agencies like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, et cetera, have shaped the Caribbean and how, other agencies on, so it's both a plus and minus question in a sense, right? How those agencies have affected us, but also how our own agencies like CARICOM particularly have impacted and shaped our development today.
Sure. I mean, you raised so many good points. So I want to make sure that I hit on as many of them as possible. Okay. So with regard to the whole issue of structural adjustment, particularly back in the late 80s, early 90s, etc., you often hear this phrase bandied about now, and to some extent, it is indeed true that the IMF of today is not your grandfather's IMF, right? Back during the 1980s and 90s, there was this whole focus that the best way for your economy to grow in order to bring prosperity to your citizens is that you liberalize your trade, you liberalize your financial markets, and those kinds of things. And what that thinking, that neoliberal thinking tended to do, those of you who follow political economy, this would be nothing new to you, but let me just delve in a little deeper into it. I always tell my students that theory always influences policy. And one of the best examples is this whole neoliberal theory that was pretty much in vogue back in the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, right? In that, it shaped a lot of the policy recommendations that entities like the IMF and the World Bank were making to developing countries. So you are facing balance of payments issues, you go to the IMF, recommendations that they would give to you. Okay, what you need to do is to trim the fat, i.e., get the government out of the business of doing business, let the private sector take over, and that sort of thing. And what that ended up doing was that a lot of countries thought that they had no choice but to privatize a lot of things which were once state owned. In some cases, to open their markets a lot more. And what you found happening, and Jamaica is a good example of this, as you would know, is that a lot of more competitive products from overseas, really came in and in many cases decimated the local industries. The neoliberal argument would be, but those industries weren't competitive anyway. So, if you have more competitive products coming in, that benefits consumers because it's cheaper and what have you. But that argument does not take into account the very real issue of dependency, the fact that if you decimate your local industry, you're now dependent on foreign imports for that industry. And that's really critical when it comes to food security. We're talking about food security now, right? So there's that. And there's a great film called Life and Death that you will be familiar with, right? And I think pretty much all of us who study political science would have been shown at one point in time. So there's that. But ever since the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, etc., the IMF has been undergoing a lot of reforms, right? And while they're not perfect, there is the recognition now that a lot of these neoliberal policies, there is no one size fit all policy. The approach that was taken back in the 80s and 90s, where there was a one size fits all approach, regardless of whether you're a small or big economy, there's the recognition now that that is past its sell by date, and that should not be used anymore. That you have to tailor your policies in conjunction with working with the local government, working with what's happening on the ground, and that just by simply liberalizing is not going to make your economy grow. And in many cases, it could further entrench the dependency that we're trying to get away from. Right now, in regard to if I am able to go on to the other points, okay. So in regard to the WTO now, so the WTO is really the organization, the international organization, which sets the rules for global trade. And when I say that, I always have to caution persons, because people often think about this WTO, this all-seeing WTO, which is dictating to countries. And really and truly, what the WTO is a member-driven organization. So decisions are mainly taken by consensus. One member, one vote, right? Or one voice would be the more accurate thing to say. So the thing with the WTO is that all of our countries, with the exception of the Bahamas, which is in the accession process right now, are WTO members and have a say in helping to make those rules that govern global trade. Are there issues? Of course. Are there things that we would love to see better? Of course. But I always use this analogy with students. Having the WTO is akin to having a highway with clearly demarcated lanes, um, traffic stoplights, right? Which is not to say that collisions won't happen, but if there are collisions, then you have a mechanism by which you could prove to say, well, this body cut in front of me, or this body didn't stop at the major stop or whatnot, right? So while the WTO is not perfect, and no international organization is, no entity is, it at least gives us a rules-based training system, and it also gives us the ability, if it is that we feel as though our rights have been infringed, or better yet, more accurately, if we feel as though another country is not playing fair, we could bring a dispute to the WTO. Of course, there are issues with that in terms of the costs, etc., but it can be done. Look at the US and Antigua. That could be a whole topic, even, right? But in theory, it can be done and has been done. Okay, so finally, with regard to CARICOM, so CARICOM is the Caribbean community and is a common market, and it has the intention of becoming a single economy. And we know there are 5 core freedoms: freedom of capital, freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of skilled nationals, provision of services, and the right of establishment. And ideally, it means that it creates this single economic space in which persons who are part of CARICOM, and there are 15 member countries, 14 member countries, one dependency, which would be Montserrat. That allows them to have that space in which to trade and to live and work, etc. Of course, there's still issues with regard to implementation, and anybody who's ever paid attention to CARICOM knows that the implementation deficit has been a real bugbear for the region. Decisions are taken at the regional level, but then when it comes to the national level, there's not always that follows through. But once there's that follows through, it is going to help create this single space that operates for the prosperity of the region and the region's citizens.
That point really hones in on my next question. I think in a lot of ways, oftentimes when we focus on trade, it is in connection to the global north. But what are the trade relations? What do they look like intra-regionally, or even with our neighbors in Latin America, Central America, et cetera?
Sure. So intra-regional trade is pretty small. I mean, the figures that you get range from 12% to 14%. The highest I've heard is about 16 or 18%, but most of the figures tend to be between 12 to 14%, compared to our trade with the world, right? The problem is that in many cases, there are many things that make it difficult to trade within the region. And when we're talking here, we're more so speaking about goods trade, but I will touch on services shortly. So if I forget, please prompt me, right? Okay, so in terms of goods trade, there are lots of competing goods in the region. A lot of us produce the same thing. So there might not always be that real business case for importing from the region in some cases, because it would just be another brand of something that you already produce. But then in some cases where there is that need, in some cases you have issues with logistics, because believe it or not, it is very difficult sometimes to do business within the region because of the logistical challenges, whether it's in terms of airlift, whether it's in terms of freight, sea freight. You might not have the level of connectivity that you will have with North America, for instance. So I always tell people it is cheaper for me, and we coming out to the services part, it's cheaper for me to fly to Miami than it is sometimes to fly to some other countries in the Caribbean, right? Because of the high cost of interregional trade. A lot of it is because of taxes that the governments put on the airline tickets, which set up the price. Even in terms of sometimes like sending a document from one island to the next, by courier. It has to go through like Puerto Rico or, Panama or whatever before it actually gets to the other island, right? So if it is that we want to promote interregional trade, we have to deal with the connectivity. We have to deal with what are some of the goods that really realistically we could trade better within the region, or we could source more from within the region. And lastly, I will also talk about in terms of the rules, the regulations, etc. So in some cases, it is harder to get a product into another Caribbean country than it is to get in a foreign market because of the level of restrictions, the standards that you have to meet, etc. So that is another issue as well, and all of these things are being addressed at the CARICOM level. The problem, of course, is the follow through at the national level, the implementation. No, oh, I forgot to mention one thing, if you permit me. With regard to Latin America, no, the Latin American one is interesting. And I think there are several reasons for this, but it's interesting because of the trade agreements that we have with other countries, the majority are with Latin American countries. We have the EPA with the EU and now the UK. That's a whole different story, which is not a trade agreement, it's a trade arrangement with the US, Sabera, and CBTPA. Then you have the Caribbean, which is another preferential arrangement one way with Canada. But then in terms of agreements, trade agreements, we also have these things called partial scope agreements, which are agreements which only cover a narrow amount of goods to be traded with Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, Costa Rica. And we have a FTA with the Dominican Republic. As you know, as part of CARIFORUM, Dominican Republic, CARICOM, CARIFORUM, we have the EPAs with the EU and the UK now. Now, why I say all of this is because our trade with Latin America in many cases is still pretty underdeveloped, right? And underperforming. And there's been a lot of work done by IDB in particular, looking at ways in which that trade could be improved, right? So most of our trade still remains, as we know, with the US, the UK, Europe, etc., increasingly with China. But there is the need to help develop more intra-regional trade and also Latin American trade. But you have barriers not only in terms of the regulations, but also in terms of logistics. In the case of Latin America, language is another thing because many of them speak Spanish. Brazil is Portuguese, and then the cultural barriers as well. So those are something that have to be addressed if we want to increase the trade with Latin America and more Caribbean countries.
The point I also wanted to touch on as you were talking that I thought of is the way that, when people think of tariffs, I think they oftentimes think of, from like a macro level, right? They're thinking of the cost to governments or, major national entities or whatever. But those tariffs and taxes also really affect your like lay people, right? And so I remember even recently I was having a conversation, very random conversation about washing machines and the cost of washing machines here, as opposed to, if you were to get one from abroad and have it shipped down, right? There are tons of shipping agencies and things that I think have spurned up a lot significantly very recently, but there is a reason why, the system works in itself to maintain these tariffs because as someone was explaining to me, the cost that it would get to, if you were to try to like ship a washing machine in that you bought from a, US store or whatever to the Caribbean, after it goes through customs and all of that, taxes, et cetera, what it would cost compared to, what you would get in Jamaica, at least at like a courts or something, right? There are ways that these systems continue to maintain itself that, to your recommendation, if we focused a little bit more on developing our trade internally, they might shift a little bit. And obviously that does not necessarily go for everybody, but very much so thinking from the Jamaica context immediately.
I completely agree with you. And one of the things is with regard to those tariffs is that customs duties, a lot of our government still see customs duties as a major form of revenue for them, right? So there's really not much incentive for them to make it easier for you to buy things overseas and bring in because they're getting to collect the duties. Another thing is that a lot of them are thinking about foreign exchange because every time that we purchase something overseas, that's foreign exchange leaving the country, right? And so that's one of the things that they have, you know, high in their mind, the fact that we want to make sure that we preserve as much foreign exchange as possible, because we need it in order to meet our basic needs. And in Barbados, for example, that was really acute, you know, when we were going through, you know, some really difficult economic times right before COVID hit. You know, the government put in place a 2% tax on credit card transactions, really as a disincentive, you know, to persons trying to import things and that sort of thing. Disincentive, yes, but also in a way to try to make back the foreign exchange that would be lost. Because what a lot of Bajans have started doing, because of how high our cost of living is here, is easier for us to go overseas and buy something and bring it in than to purchase it here. So I just wanted to agree with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question, I would, be remiss if I didn't bring this one up. I think especially having a legal scholar on the podcast, there are a lot of ways, as you mentioned, that, CARICOM, et cetera, have worked together to create economies that hopefully improve our region. But there also have been intra-regional disagreements about trade. So in your vast experience, I'm sure, what have been some of the few really defining cases that have dictated Caribbean trade relations and challenges in the region?
Sure. I mean, there have been several. So, for your audience who might not be as familiar, the Caribbean Court of Justice has two functions. It not only in its original jurisdiction deals with the interpretation of the revised treaty of Chagaramas, which is a legal document which created the CARICOM single market economy. In its appellate function, it is the final court of appeal for a few of the CARICOM members, not all by any means, only a few. Think about 5 now or 6. St. Lucia recently joined the appellate jurisdiction. But to say that so the case law that comes out of the CCJ in its original jurisdiction is really what helps to ensure that the rights that accrue to us under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas are indeed respected, so to speak. So let's give an example. So with regard to the Myri case, which is something that a lot of people would have heard about, that dealt, of course, with the movement ability to move, right? And that was a case that really solidified the fact that you can't just deny entry to another CARICOM national on a whim, right? You have to give them the 6 months, to stay in the country if they wanted to. You have to make sure that they're treated well. You can't ill treat them, right? Not saying that you could ill treat other people, but under the freedom of movement, there are certain things that accrue to you as a CARICOM national. So if you go to a CARICOM national's country, for instance, you will see that in the immigration lines, they have a line for CARICOM local and then a line for international. Yeah. Okay, so that's one. Another would be cases which deal with in what instances could you suspend the common external tariff, right? The common external tariff is basically, as it sounds, the list of tariffs that we would charge for imports coming from outside of the CARICOM Customs Union, right? So there have been some cases where countries have unilaterally suspended the common external tariff for a good. That's been an area where there's been several areas of case law developed as well. So what ends up happening is that sometimes a business might say the products that we are getting in the region are of inferior quality, or we're not getting it in the quantity that we want, could you suspend the CT on this so we could bring in the product more cheaply from overseas? And depending on whether the country has followed the procedure or not, sometimes they end up being, for want of a better word, sued, by a private entity, or sometimes in conjunction with the home state of the private entity, because they argue that the host state did not follow the procedure. So that has been another area of case law that has been pretty well developed as well. And basically, a lot of it is to try to ensure that the rights under the treaty are respected by host governments.
One of the last questions, I think, just wrapping up our episode today, which I think was really informative and I truly enjoyed, coming especially off the heels of COVID-19 and the effects of the pandemic on our region, on trade and our development, thinking of the climate crisis, several other factors, of course, could be named. What do you think should be the ways that we support the future of Caribbean development, especially, coming off the heels of this economic downturn?
Sure, and that is such a deep question, and is a question that persons have been grappled with for so many years. It is really something. For me, I think a lot of it comes down to our people. Our people are our greatest resource, and I know that's a bit cliche, but really and truly, it is the truth. When you think about it, so many of our people feel as though they can't make a contribution here because of the economic situation or whatever. So they have to go overseas, and they're going overseas and they're doing great things. So I could just cite a few examples. You have, in the area of creative industries, you have Bob Marley, Jamaican. You have Rihanna, who's still alive. You have persons in the area of track and field. Jamaicans have been lighting up the track, as you know, in track and field. You have the person who invented the first search engine, a Barbadian, Alan Entich, right? You have a Bajan who is based in Canada right now, Dr. Juliet Daniel, who is doing pioneering research on breast cancer, particularly triple negative breast cancer. And I say all of this to say this. Imagine if these people could have been successful here in the region, if we had the infrastructure that they needed in order to do this greatness here. Because a lot of the money that would be made by these people would be made overseas and will be developing the economies of overseas and not so much Caribbean economies. They try to give back, but there's only so much they can do if they're based overseas. So it's important that we try to build that infrastructure that is needed so persons could do their greatness, for want of a better term, here. We have to ensure that we invest in our young people, ensure our education system supports the type of industries and the type of economy, the sustainable and inclusive economies that we want to build, right? And finally, and I always say this, we have to ensure that the policies that we put in place, the trade policies, the investment policies, the policies with regard to education, MSMEs, mutually reinforce each other and cohere with each other and support that inclusive Caribbean economy that we want to build and we want to see.
Perfectly said. Thank you so much. Now, final question. Listeners know my favorite question. You also mentioned two that I actually had in my mind before we even recorded. But you mentioned Harry Belafonte's song, of course. You also mentioned Life and Debt. But what are some of your favorite ways that this history of Caribbean trade and development shows up in popular culture?
Sure. I mean, for me, one of my favorites is in Calypso. I love Calypso. And when I was thinking about preparing for this podcast, the first Calypso that came to mind was The Caribbean Man by Black Stallion, right? May he rest in peace. He talks about West Indian unity and the political malaise, but how if we forge that West Indian unity how we could be. And I think about his words, we must push for one common intention for a better life in the region for we women and we children. That must be the intention of the Caribbean man. And I'll end with that.
Well, of course, listeners, if you haven't checked that one out, I will link it, of course, in our show notes, etc. Also, I will link a lot of the acronyms. I know there were quite a few based off, no worries, based off the fact that this is was, a little bit of a not complicated episode, but there's a lot of agencies and things that goes into it. So I will link, and explain a lot of the acronyms, etc. As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Alicia, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your wisdom with us. And as always, everybody, lickle more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.